All right, so hi everyone. We are very lucky here today to be joined by the wonderful Deirdre McCloskey, distinguished economist, public intellectual, and one of the finest scholars of economic history. She's Professor Emerita of 6 disciplines, including English and communication at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Alongside her major contributions to economics, history, methodology, rhetoric, and other fields, she's written over 400 articles and at least 25 books. I keep losing count because she's been so prolific recently. Bettering Humanomics came out last year to acclaim. And this year in June, I believe, we're expecting Beyond Positivism, Behaviorism, and New Institutionalism in economics. So very exciting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm not in Chicago now. For a couple of months, I'm staying with my sister in Tucson, up in the hills. It's so strange to move from Chicago, where it's 10 degrees below 0 Celsius to this marvelous climate. So shall I speak for a while, or how do you want me to do it?
Yes, so roughly I've allotted about the first 2/3 for a discussion regarding the Great Enrichment and the Bourgeois Virtues, and the final third for the sins of economics and the need for humanomics. But I'm not immune to delightful tangents. I'm sure we'll venture in different directions, and we'll invite the audience to comment and ask questions instead of just blocking Q&A for the end.
Yeah, and please do raise your hand or shout and scream to get attention if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment or say that's crazy or anything that you want to do. I'm a economist by sort of origin, but I've been about everything that an economist can be over my long life. When I was a teenager, I was a socialist. I was a folk singing a person of the left, and then in college, because that's what was on offer, I was a Keynesian, and then I was a social engineer, sort of, and that my first job, and I eventually tenured there, was at the famous University of Chicago in the 1970s, which was its great era. It was wonderful to be an assistant and eventually an associate professor there, because there was so much creativity in ideas. And so I taught undergraduate and graduate courses there, price theory and so forth. And then I came to the University of Iowa for 19 years, and there I reformed myself. I tried not to forget the economics. I tried not to forget the quantitative and mathematical things that I had learned especially as a graduate student. But I tried to educate myself in the humanities. And there was a long period in which I published books and articles and blah, 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 about what I called the rhetoric of economics, how economists actually argue with each other. And then slowly, at the behest of my friends who kept saying, now, dear, speech matters in the economy too, not just among scholars or scientists, but in the economy. Finally, in the 90s and then into the 2000s, I started, as the English say, I twigged to that, and in the early 2000s started to produce on this notion of the bourgeois virtues, which was my first book on that matter in when was it, 2006. And then I realized, and that for an economist this is really nice. I saw that this argument I was making about the bourgeoisie, historically speaking, and their role in bringing us to an enriched modern world could be used to face the great question in economics. Adam Smith, I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith, I'm an Anglican. Adam Smith's great question of the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And so in my second book, and what I fondly call my trilogy on the bourgeois era, in 2010, I went through all the causes that economists and historians have devised for thinking about the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, and gradually rejected more or less all of them in favor of what you could call an ideational view of how we became rich, not in sort of Hegel's, it's not Hegel, it's not idealism as it's called in philosophy, but it's an ideational explanation, arguing that after all, innovation, especially innovation, not so much routines, but innovation, new things in art, in language, in science, in ordinary life, and in the economy, comes out of human minds. Indeed, it has to come out of one human mind. Then if that human mind can persuade others, that maybe we'll all become enthusiasts for this innovation, whatever it is, innovation in politics, innovation in business. So in other words, I came to the view, which I've gotten clearer about in the last few years, I have to say, that what economics needs and what economic history needs and history needs is to focus more on the initiation of new ideas. In other words, to put it just in simple terms, it should focus more on creativity. Now, the argument I make it can be summarized in lots of ways. One way that you can always think about any scientific theory is what it denies, all right? The theory of Newton's formula for gravitational attraction says that it's an inverse square law, not an inverse cube law or an inverse 1/2 law, it's a square law. So it denies those others. In fact, interestingly, in Newton's case, it denies the question, what is the essence of gravity? Or what is the cause of gravity? It just says gravity and its inverse square. And that's quite general in science, in scholarship too. If you to take a slightly crazy case, if you think that Shakespeare's plays were actually written by the Earl of Oxford, then you're denying that there was a creative person called Shakespeare, who wrote the plays. So what am I denying with this ideational human mind understanding of how we got rich? Well, it seems to me, and I hope you agree, that broadly speaking, there are two ways of talking about how we got rich that are the conventional ways. One, you can assign to the political right, or perhaps the middle, which is that savings, virtuous abstention from consumption, is what caused the modern world. That capital accumulation, that's what accomplished it. You saved and you invested in cotton mills and railways, and so we got rich. That's one side. That's from the right, so to speak. And then from the left, the cause of the modern world is various kinds of exploitation. That they say, it's claimed on the left that the English working class was exploited. A spoof version of this is a sentence from the great book. Everyone should read this book, 1066 and All That, first published in 1930 by a couple of English humorists. It's a spoof history of England, and it speaks of the Industrial Revolution in the following terms. Around 1800, all the rich men in England realized that women and children could work 25 hours a day without most of them dying or becoming excessively deformed. This was called the Industrial Revelation. A version of, a serious version of this, of course, is classical Marxism and its descendants, such as the notion that imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, are lively, still lively in the minds of a great many people who think about these matters. So it's either virtuous accumulation, or in Marxist terms, it's the accumulation of surplus value by extending the length of the workday and all that kind of talk, that then feeds into the accumulation of capital. So in fact, both the left and the right believe that why we got rich is by piling up bricks and BAs, physical capital and human capital. Now, I don't think either of these is correct. And in that, a book of this, the middle volume of this trilogy of the bourgeois era, published in 2010, I tell why I don't believe them. By the way, I don't think people should just announce theories and then ignore all the alternatives. I don't think that's a very smart way to proceed in science. I think that if there are lots of other scientists who believe that capital accumulation from high savings is the source, and they're honest people, they're not, bad people, and we should ask whether they're right and look into their arguments. And if there are people who say that it's imperialism, it's stealing from the third world that made Europe rich, then we ought to look into that. And in this matter, at least, we ought to look into it quantitatively, though also qualitatively, both. But there should be numbers. I'm an economist, and I think that numbers sometimes respond to scientific and scholarly questions. So there should be a quantitative inquiry. And that's what I tried to provide, a qualitative and a quantitative inquiry into each of these large possibilities in all their various forms. And there are subcategories of this. People who say that foreign trade is an engine of growth. People who say, and this is quite fashionable at the World Bank these days, that it's institutions. It's better institutions that make us rich. And then there are people who say, aha, it's coal. My friend Matt Ridley is a big exponent of coal as the crucial matter. So I looked into this. So how did it come out? Well, there are two ways of facing these alternative, dual approaches, either the conservative one or the left-wing one. The old joke is there are two kinds of people who divide people into two parts and people who don't. So you can make what you want of that philosophical joke. But the two ways are economic analysis and historical analysis. So suppose we think about this first so-called conservative story, which is that once we were poor and we didn't save much, and then we saved in the 18th century in England, we saved more, and then there was what Rostow long ago called a takeoff into self-sustained growth, caused by the rise in the savings ratio and therefore accumulation of capital. And the trouble with this, economically speaking, is that sheer accumulation without some new idea of what to do, sheer more roads, more houses, more factories, more, has, as Keynes said in 1936, sharply diminishing returns. I mean, think of your own case. So suppose you have an automobile. You also have one automobile. That's nice. It's very convenient. You can drive to work and so forth. Now imagine that you got a second automobile. Well, it might be of some use if your husband and you want to trade off. You can both have a car. That's nice. Okay, now suppose you have a third car, and a fourth, and a fifth, and it's quite clear in this personal case that the fifth car is going to be, compared to its cost, a burden. Actually, you're going to have to find parking places for it. You have to pay taxes. It's just going to be an irritating inconvenience, and that's because you have no innovation in the use of automobiles. You're using the automobile to get to work or to go shopping or something, and that's it. And so having 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cars doesn't make any sense at all. But that's the claim of the sheer capital accumulation argument. Observe, the actual big capital accumulations like the railway or electricity generation or the system of roadways we have, or the great construction of high rises or something, those have value to us because they embody a novelty, a new idea that came out of someone's head. I live downtown in Chicago, and I live in a high-rise building, well, not too high, 13 floors. It was built in 1912 as a factory, and then a long time afterwards was made into apartments, and I have one of the apartments, but it's made of reinforced concrete. The factory was a printing factory, which in 1912 made sense, was an innovation, was a smart thing to do, was not just a sheer accumulation, because across the street was a railway station, and printing and publishing is a transportation intensive industry. You bring in the paper, you print something on it, you send out the heavy paper. So sheer accumulation is not how we become rich. The same thing is true even of human capital. And I ought to have said somewhat earlier than now the magnitude that we're speaking of. And suppose I just spend a few minutes on that, because it's crucially important for all these arguments. Since 1800, in the entire world, real income per head has increased by a factor of 10. In the countries like Finland or Japan, that in 1800 were unspeakably poor, it's increased more like a factor of 40 since 1800. If you allow for the improved quality of many of the goods and services that we make and earn and consume, such as improved medicine, cleaner food, larger and better heated houses, and so forth. If you include an allowance for improved quality, the factor of increase in the countries that have done very well, and to be followed by other countries like China and India, which are growing very fast nowadays, is more like, now hear this, a factor of 100, 10,000%. So what we're dealing with, the explicandum, the thing we're trying to explain, is an enormous percentage increase in income per head, utterly unprecedented. It was not uncommon for incomes to double from time to time. It's probably the case that the oil, wheat, and wine economy of the Eastern Mediterranean, invented, so to speak, early in the first millennium BCE, could easily have doubled incomes per head in Greece. It wouldn't be shocking if in the Song dynasty in China about 1,000 years ago, this highly commercialized and inventive society, there quite possibly incomes increased by a considerable amount, maybe as much as 100%. But in all cases, up to the last one, up to the Industrial Revolution, and then its much more significant Great Enrichment afterwards, after 1850, it's not, each time it reverted, that is income per head, reverted back to the $2 or $3 a day per person. That was the human fate up to 1800. $2 or $3 a day. It sounds incredible, but it's what South Sudan earns per person per day. In 1800, the most prosperous countries were England, Britain more accurately, because Ireland did not share in this. Holland, specifically the northern part of the Low Countries, and the American English colonies, they were earning and making about $6 a day. Whereas in a modern rich economy like Britain's or the United States, income per head is well over $100 a day per person. So that's the change we're talking about. That's the explicandum. Okay, now go back to capital. Even human capital, which has obviously increased. I think most people here, I mean, everyone here can read, whereas my Irish ancestors couldn't. My Norwegian ancestors could, because they were Lutherans, and they were, both men and women were required to be able to read the Bible. But my Irish ancestors were Catholics, and they weren't required to read the Bible. So there's been a large increase in human capital, but that doesn't come close to explaining in it by itself a factor of 30 or 20 or 10 or 100, these enormous figures. Look, how much more does a college graduate earn in the United States, say, than a person who's just a high school graduate? Well, maybe 2 times over her lifespan. That's 100%. That's the old 100%. That doesn't, 100% doesn't explain, you know, 1,000, say 3,000%. So that's the economic problem. The other problem, the historical problem, I told you there were 2 techniques of finding out whether these arguments that are conventional work. There's one is economic, the other is historical. And the historical problem is that humans have always saved. Sometimes have had very high savings rates. Interesting one is that in the European Middle Ages, peasants saved about 20% of their grain crop. What? What's going on here? Well, the yield per unit of seed of grain was only 4 or 5 in the Middle Ages. This is quite unlike rice in Eastern and South Asia. But for wheat and barley and oats, you put 1 grain into the earth, you get 4 or 5 out in the next harvest. So perforce, if you're going to have a next harvest, you've got to save an enormous amount. But capital accumulation, to make it, to give other examples, is routine in human history. The Grand Canal in China, which linked the Yellow River of the north with the Yangtze in the south, was the longest canal in human history, and it was built 1,000 years ago. The Roman roads, which we can still see in Britain, or especially in England. If by chance you come on an English country road to a long straight stretch, a couple of miles, a mile or so, you know you're on an old Roman road. So there is something wrong with the idea that sheer capital accumulation could do it. So that's what's wrong with the tale from conservatives. Then go to the tail from the left. And you have essentially the same problem. The problem is that stealing from people, exploiting people, doesn't, rather obviously, let's talk of the economics now, make everyone rich. How would that work out? The argument, the sort of classic Marxist argument, as I said before, is that the surplus value extracted from the English working class is then applied to investment. But then you've got this notion of sheer investment, of mere investment, you might say. And it has the same problems as on the other side of the fence. And indeed, let's take another example. There is a great excitement these days in the United States about, in history departments, about rethinking, as they say they're doing, the history of American slavery, and claiming, as Abraham Lincoln did famously in his second inaugural address, that the wealth of the United States depended on slavery. And if you look into the economics of this or the history of this, you've just got a lot of wrong thinking. The profits from the slave trade or the owning of the slaves was normal in the sense that it was perhaps 5% a year. It was what you could expect in investing in the funds, investing in some other part of the economy. It was not unusually high. So there was no great fund of profits. You see, it's analogous to the exploitation of the working class or the third world through imperialism. There was no great fund that then could be used to do sheer investment. Reminding ourselves that sheer investment couldn't be the source of such an enormous enrichment. And indeed, it can be argued, and I can explain this if you want, that the real profits from the slave trade, which, by the way, went mainly to Brazil from West Africa, what was earned by kings in Africa. Their specialization in violence was what created created profits, and yet profits in these African kingdoms did not result in a great enrichment. And indeed, to go back to the historical way of arguing these points, the East African slave trade, now we've switched, we're not talking about the Atlantic slave trade, but the East African slave trade north into the Arab world and the Ottoman world, it was longer and as large as the Atlantic slave trade, quantitatively speaking, yet there was no slave-caused enrichment of the Middle East. Constantinople and Istanbul, to look at another slave trade, for a long time was supplied from Slavs, the remnants of the Golden Horde, the Mongols, north of the Black Sea, entertained themselves by riding north, seizing Slavic peasants and selling them in the slave markets of Constantinople, otherwise known as Istanbul. Yet that didn't make anyone, the Golden Horde or Istanbul, into a modern industrial enriched economy. Okay, so neither the sheer accumulation argument nor the exploitation arguments work. And I can go on and on like this. I went on for 500 pages in this volume in 2010 that I mentioned. So, come on. Tell me what your answer is. Stop saying what's wrong with the others, although I think it's an honorable thing to do. Tell me, Deirdre, what is the cause? And the cause is innovation. Now that has to be distinguished, you understand, from sheer investment. Sometimes sheer investment is necessary. Sometimes sheer investment, capital accumulation, is very unimportant. Think of modern apps, computer and internet apps. They don't really involve any capital at all. Okay, invention. Not just scientific invention, although that can be part of the story. Eventually, science becomes more and more important. Certainly by after the First World War, science is a big part of how we get rich. But I would claim, contrary to my friend Joel Mokyr, that science in the 18th century and the 19th century does not make much contribution to the economy. But what does make a contribution is ingenuity. Ingenuity. What's the word that people always use? Well, anyway, thinking up new ways. A wig maker invented the machine that made, in the 18th century, the cotton textile industry. A wig maker. So there's this ingenuity. A blacksmith in England invented the first marine chronometer that allowed you to calculate longitude in the sea, and so forth. Ingenuity exploded. Now, why? Why did it explode? Why is the rate of innovation, and essentially all you need to convince yourself of this is to start naming inventions, improvements. Reinforced concrete. I spoke about my own 13-story building in Chicago. It's made of reinforced concrete. Reinforced concrete was invented in the 1850s by the owner of an estate in France who was very interested in his garden. And he took the ancient technology of concrete and put the new cheap steel inside it in the form of screens, which had been invented in the 1840s in England. So if you put screening into concrete, it's much stronger than it is if you just have the concrete. So you can build a 13-story building, or indeed a 100-story building out of reinforced concrete. And if you just go through them, one after another, you start getting hundreds of innovations. Screw propellers in ships, invented by the Swede John Ericsson. To stick with Sweden for a moment, ball bearings, which make possible steel on steel, fast turning things like airplane, or for that matter, automobile motors. Ball bearings are essential for modern machinery. They were invented in Sweden in the late 19th century, but you can hardly stop. It goes on and on. Containerization was invented in 1956 by a man named Malcolm McLean in North Carolina. We've all heard about Edison, but actually a whole slew of other people were working on the problem of electrical illumination, and on and on and on. So why was there such an explosion? Having established that the other arguments from the left and right don't work, we've got this ideational argument, this ideational explanation, this explosion of human ingenuity after 1800, which is now spreading to China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, and blah, blah, blah. They're all inventing things like that. Now, how is this? Why did it happen? It happened, I claim, on account of the birth in the 18th century of the ideas causing ideas, of liberalism. And that idea, in one sentence, is that no one shall be a slave or a child. No adult shall be a slave or a child to anyone. No wife a slave to a husband. It took a long time to clear up. My mother, who died earlier this year at 98, until the 1960s, she couldn't have a checking account without the permission of her husband. So that took a long time, but no enslavement of a Black person or a Slav or whoever you want to name to some master. No enslavement of a citizen to the state. Everyone to be treated as an adult. In fact, liberalism could be called adultism. So then the question obviously is, where does that come from? And in my third volume, which I urge you all to buy and read, especially buy, called Bourgeois Equality, it's the subtitle summarizes what I'm saying here, how ideas, not capital or institutions, enrich the world. That's volume 3. It was published in 2016. And it goes back into the rather recent history of Europe, starting in 1517. We historians tend to think in long periods, with the Protestant Reformation, the Dutch Revolt, the English Civil War, the English so-called Glorious Revolution, 1689, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the invention of not really the invention, the extension of the printing press. The printing press was not invented in Germany, as everyone thinks. It was invented in China hundreds of years before and resulted in the publication of very large numbers of books in Chinese characters, which we still can examine. So all those revolts and revolutions and so on could have gone the other way. They could have failed. Had the Spanish Armada been able to land the best army in Europe in 1588 on the south coast of England, England would have become Roman Catholic again. Holland, the Dutch across the North Sea, who relied for the balance of power on the English, would have been conquered as well. And the radical Reformation, not so much the, let's think of it as radical Protestants, would all have been crushed. If Archbishop Laud and Charles I had been sensible people, they were both jerks. The English Revolution might not have happened, and so on and so forth. Had the French not come to the aid of the Americans in the English Revolution, the capital of the British Empire might now be in Washington, and so forth. So all these things could have gone the other way. And that's why I say accidents, because I don't think there's anything deeply European about liberalism in possibility or modern economic growth in actuality. Now, countries that are very non-European, China and India, are growing like mad because they finally adopted, after long periods of attempting to do things top-down with central planning, both countries in 1978 in China, 1991 in India, they started to move, at least in the economy, to liberalism, to allowing people to be free adults. So that's my tale. It's, in a way, it's a very old-fashioned claim that I'm making. You can find people like Thomas Babington Macaulay, a great, or anyway, an interesting historian and essayist in England in the early, in Scotland too, and in Britain in the early 19th century, making claims rather similar to the one I'm making. Liberalism is the secret sauce, you might say, of the modern world. It's the spring. Institutions, capital accumulation, education, canals, rule of law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all necessary and very, very nice and helpful gears in the economic watch. But the spring that put the whole thing into astonishing motion after 1800 was the bizarre notion, the notion very strange in an agricultural society such as we've had in many parts of the world, that all men and women are created equal. This is a shocking absurdity in the minds of most people in the 18th century, and it's only advanced intellectuals who take it at all seriously. Even Thomas Jefferson, who wrote those very words, didn't free his slaves after his death, didn't free his slaves who were his own children after his death. So it was a slow coming we had of it. I don't mean that there was kind of instant outbreak of liberalism and everything happened. Slowly, slowly, slowly. We freed poor men, slaves, colonial people. In Protestant countries, freed Catholics, women, gays, even, I must say, thank God, transgendered folk. And out of this has come this astonishing creativity of the modern world. And that is the ideational explanation. That's what made us rich. So thank you.
Thank you. So we'll open it up for some questions before we move on to discussions about humanomics. Eloy, I think you've had a question.
Sure.
Hi, hello. I'm a big fan, Dr. McCloskey.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is actually more of a practical question. I actually use even your textbook for price theory.
Good. Then your students will actually learn economics.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. I was wondering, like, given what you talked about how ideas serve as a backdrop for what should be economics, what do you think is the role of price theory, like classical price theory, the one applied price theory in your book, in teaching? That's my first question.
Okay, wait. I'll answer that question then come back to you. The answer is that I've gradually become an Austrian economist. The Austrian school, I think, has at least innovation right. I'm not so sure of their banking ideas and macroeconomics. I'm not so thrilled by that. But their idea is to emphasize ideas and creativity. Their word is discovery. And so let's see, I've lost track of your question. Remind me in a few words.
Price theory tied to what
Oh,
you
yeah,
said.
yeah, okay. Here's the answer. The price theory is an accurate, sensible way of talking about sustaining what we have now, the circular flow. To keep things going, we need the efficiency of marginal cost equals marginal benefit. But, as the Austrians say, to raise the production possibility curve, to have this creativity, we need to have non-equilibrium. We need to be taking advantage of what Israel Kirzner, a rabbi and a wonderful economist, born in Britain, lives in the United States. He makes this point. He says that we have to have alertness, and out of that came the modern world, alertness. I've argued with Israel that you also need a persuasive environment, which is more of liberalism. You need free speech, and people have to listen to each other, or these ideas are just ideas.
My other question, I wonder if it would be a better fit to the second part of the discussion about humanomics, but the things that you talked about economics and your ideas in terms of, and how they link to the humanities. I'm a recovering economist.
Aren't we all?
I did, and I was actually blessed that I actually was able to do my PhD in the New School, and I did a postgraduate work at George Mason. So I was able to get like the best of both worlds.
That's a very good combination.
But the thing is that nowadays, when you talk about economics, people actually get frustrated in terms of what you. I left academia, so basically, I publish like very sporadically, depending on and things that I work on. But I took a different tack in my profession. But I wonder, and you don't need to answer this right now. What would be the advice for people that actually love economics? They see that there is potential of economics to contribute to debates as a discipline that opens the scope for people to become public. I don't want to call it like public intellectuals, but actually that they actually have they want to say something about the world.
Sure.
But how do you go about to do that?
I would do exactly what you've done, which is to stay. If I were studying economics now, and I had any sense, which you evidently have, I'd go to both the New School and to George Mason, and then maybe to top it off, I'd have a postdoc at MIT, and then you'd be supplied with all the tools. You'd have the right questions, which you learned at the New School and at George Mason, and you'd have the conventions of how to sustain it. But we will, in fact, speak about this more.
Wonderful. Next, we have Peter.
Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction to how we became so fabulously wealthy. I particularly appreciate that you started off with our minds. I'm a neurobiologist.
There you go.
By training, and a neuroethicist for the last 15 years. But I'm not an economist. And I haven't read I haven't read any of your 30 or so books.
Shameful.
So forgive me if you've answered this question elsewhere, but it's something that I really noticed in the presentation was missing for me.
Sure.
As you talked about the amazing increase in wealth per day, let's say from 1800 to today, I was thinking about my family. I was born in rural agrarian Hungary, Anna is from. And when I think about my grandfather in the late 1800s, or my great grandfather, they were farmers, and they did okay, but they were poor farmers. Sure. And when I think about the increase in wealth that I have compared to them, it's remarkable.
It's astounding.
But what's missing from that equation, from that accounting, and I'm not an accountant either, so I'm not, I don't know how to do the numbers, but I can certainly spot when something is missing. And you mentioned that economists think about long term. Over those 200 years, where is the accounting for the accumulated externalities that we humans have put on this planet, and the cost of that, and will that show up as something that comes to bite us? Well, it seems like it's biting us in some ways already. And how do we account for that in our accumulation of wealth?
Well, if we do it right, we account for it. It's not just to be. I don't have any sympathy with the view that we can just ignore global warming or plastic, which I heard last night on the BBC is I've known it before, but it's becoming worse and worse. There's plastic everywhere. We're breathing plastic right now. All right, and then that will reduce some from this extraordinary improvement. But I think you'll agree that that in total, your Hungarian ancestors, I mean, put it the other way, you're vastly better off than your Hungarian ancestors, as I'm vastly better off than my Irish ancestors. And indeed, in some respects, you and I are better off than, well, the urban and many of the rural versions of our ancestors. For example, air pollution has declined radically in rich countries in the last, well, since I was a child. When I was a young child in Boston in the 1940s, my mother, who was an opera singer, but also a very good house cleaner, would clean the sills of our apartment in the morning. And by the evening, you could run your finger through it and it would come up black, right, from the soot. When I was a teenager, we went to England for a while. And this literally happened to me. One night I was going to go out to the local coffee house. I was 16, so I did that kind of thing in Camberley, Surrey. And I came out the front door, and hear this. This is 1959. This is after the great catastrophe in London, 6 years after the great catastrophe in London, that started the modern cleanup of soft coal. I couldn't see my feet. Well, you don't walk around if you can't see your feet. So I went back inside and didn't go to the coffee house. So some things have improved. The ozone hole. Margaret Thatcher was a leader in this, which I find amusing. Margaret Thatcher was a very heavy user of hairspray. And as you know, absurdly, hairspray was a cause of the widening, one of the causes of the widening of the ozone hole. Yet Margaret Thatcher, and a bunch of other people, not necessarily conservatives, got together and said, let's have no more of that. So look, here's what I would assert, and I think you'll probably agree, that overall environmental degradation included, your life is better than your ancestors by a quite large amount. And out of that increased welfare, not just welfare, out of that increased ability, we can perhaps, and I'm an optimist, I think we can find solutions to these environmental problems we have. So yeah.
Can I just reply? Because
Very briefly.
I want to hold your
Very
feet to the
briefly
fire.
without, yeah, what?
Which is that I agree with you that the quality of my life versus my grandfather's or my great-grandfather's life, yeah, sure. I have the luxury, I am the recipient of all of the wealth and and that is dependent on all those externalities. But what I was asking for is, as an economist, not anecdotal commentary, but actually accounting. Is there a way that we can do accounting?
Here it is. Here's the accounting. Income per head in the world is increasing now, and I'm not making up this figure. This is other people have said this, and they've got quite good evidence. Income per head in real terms in the world is increasing at 2% a year. That means that in 100 years, at the end of this century, say, not even 100 years, in 80 years, income per head of the globe will be 8 times what it is now. And suppose in environmental badness reduces that figure by, I don't know, 20%. Suppose, to be crazy about it, in view of the opportunities for the technological opportunities for carbon capture and so forth, suppose it cuts it by a third. We're still vastly better off, and to be very pointed in answering you, we'll have a lot more engineers, a lot more entrepreneurs thinking, now let's see, how can I make carbon capture cheap, say, to focus on that. So Denmark gets an extraordinarily high percentage of its power from windmills. But that's because Denmark is one of the richest countries in the world. So that's what I expect for the future. And if we kill growth now, if we bring in our fear about the environmental future, if we bring the growth rate down to 0, to take an extreme case, we won't, by the end of the century, have the wherewithal along the way to be facing up to the environmental problems. So who's next?
Next, we have Nasser.
Yes,
I'll try, since we haven't got an infinite amount of time, I'm going to try to be briefer, although, I've got 1,700 pages that I got to tell you about, but I'll try to be brief. You all try to be brief. Don't tell me what your question's about, just ask the question.
Okay, thanks a lot, Prof. Okay, now direct to the point that I'm a committed Muslim. When I try to strike a deal between Islam and the West, and you see that when you mention, and you also belong to the Abrahamic faith, when you mention about liberalism as the cause of human ingenuity, and in the modern world, that for us, when we hear the word liberalism, it sounds like it relativizes values. For instance, in Thailand, in Thailand, the rise of prostitution become legal; it becomes a career. So, how do you deal with this?
Well,
issue?
I don't think that liberalism needs to be amoral. I'm not an enthusiast for the idea that anything goes. I believe in the 10 Commandments. I do not believe in the 613 commandments of Orthodox Judaism. And for Islam, I recommend respectfully that Islam look into its liberal tradition. I mean, look, under the convivencia in Islamic Spain, Jews and Christians and Muslims. It's not quite what people think it is, an ideal world or something, but it was very good. And it was intellectually astounding, technologically very advanced for the time, talking about the 11th century, the 12th century. And that was a liberal version of Islam. I don't think that Islam has to be, as some versions of it are now, conservative. But look, there are some versions of Christianity that are conservative. And certainly there's some versions of Judaism that are. So I think liberalism can go together with ethical seriousness. That's what my first book in this trilogy is about. It's called The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And I'm working now on a book called, what's it called? God in Mammon. Mammon, as you may know, is the Aramaic word, the language of Jesus, for money. So God in money, or wealth, really is what it means. So, and I don't think there has to be a conflict. I'm an Anglican. We call them Episcopalians in the United States. I'm a believer. So Allah Akbar. The God is great, and you and I can go with that. Yet we can still believe in free access to trade and professions. We can still believe, and this is a more sensitive point, in the equality of women and so forth.
Thank you. Next is Anna.
Thank you so much. Similar question, or maybe not so much. This is my question as a Hungarian emigre. And one of
Well, we got a lot of Hungarians here.
Oh, I know. We attract each other. And one of those Hungarians who had to kind of, due to their liberalism, had to move somewhere else to pursue their happiness.
Really?
So I'm arguing with myself here as well. I'm really curious what you think about this. As a liberal, and I'm fully on board about this with you, what is the best argument you've ever heard against liberalism?
Well, the one that was just put forward, namely that it results in a corruption of the human spirit. If it did, if there was any substantial historical evidence that it did, I would be against it. Look, there's a famous remark in the Gospels. What matters if you gain the world and lose your immortal soul? And I take that very seriously. But that's the claim that Putin makes in his alliance with the Russian church. And I imagine, I actually don't know this, I imagine that Orban thinks of himself as allied with conservative Catholicism. I was actually in Hungary 2 weeks before the last election that Orban had, and I was stunned by the anti-Semitism evident in the posters. My friend, I'm trying to think of his name, and my good friend, what's his name? The great Hungarian economist. Gosh, it's shameful that I can't remember his name, but he's I've known him a long time, although as you can tell, not terribly well. And he told me that there was a survey of Hungarian school children, high school children, a couple of years before that election, which asked what percentage of the Hungarian population is Jewish. And the average response was 20%. Well, there are 40,000 Jews in a country of 10 million people for rather obvious historical reasons. So no, I I think it's rather left-wing or right-wing populism that corrupts the human soul, not liberalism.
Thank you very much.
And next we have Noam.
Hi. So I guess my question is, it could be that, I'm trying to make this brief, but it could be that, like, I find your argument very, very plausible and persuasive,
Good.
and
Good.
but I'm not convinced that it
money.
can. I'm not. I guess I'm skeptical about two things. One is that just people being more moral or trying to be more moral in their own personal life or spiritual outlook or religious outlook necessarily can offset, and it is sometimes a caricature, but quote unquote capitalism at its worst.
Yeah.
Say everything coming down to marginal costs and
Yeah, that's right.
and so that those kinds of problems, could that eat liberalism? Let's put
Well,
it that way.
on that point, and then you can ask the other thing. I agree with you, and I'm not although I have taught it for half a century, and I admire it as a route to efficiency. Marginal cost equals marginal benefit, and all that. Perfectly good, but it's not an ethical program. It's, greed is good is not a sensible way of being a human. As I've said at some length, and not here, but in my books. So I agree with you, but there's a wonderful remark that a political scientist at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton made, and I always forget his name too. But he was asked, does capitalism express it this way? Does capitalism, I don't like the word capitalism. I think it's a stupid word, but let's go with it. Does capitalism corrupt? And he said, yes, of course, but so does everything else. Don't need to make the case about the corruptions of orthodox communism, or for that matter, orthodox rule of the Ayatollahs, or royalty, kingship, feudalism.
I guess I would ask, how does it not transform people's ethical, just for coordination reasons?
It does.
Yeah, just for profit.
It does.
And so how do you counteract that? And you have to read your next book to find out.
It does. But honestly, dear, look, you or me trying to think up a new way of making lives more comfortable or safe or something, and then selling it is not the worst form of ethical behavior that I can think of. A much worse form is the feudal form that I have a sword and a horse, so you pay for me. And indeed, the modern state, which claims in some of its forms to be helping the poor. Most states are corrupt in the world. Most states are terrible impositions of one group on another. So I don't see market relationships as terrible. And look, as I say in my first book of these three, when you get down into the details, you will discover, I've discovered, and everyone here I think has discovered, that when you deal with people in your job or in the marketplace repeatedly, they become your friends. That's what happens. It's not that you're, that you view, now you're perfectly right that the sort of method and ideology of what I call Samuelssonian economics is to say that human beings are vending machines. And I don't care, screw them, they're not my friends, just they're vending machines. Well, no, that's terrible. And that's not what I call innovism, which I think is a much better word than capitalism, is. So it can be sweet, it can be nasty. In the stupid 1980s form of greed is good, it's nasty. And, come on.
We'll take 2 more questions, then dive into humanomics.
Okay.
Brandon.
It's exciting to be here, Professor Mccloskey. I remember studying some of your work when I was at George Mason under Professor Boudreau. So it's cool just to be able to get to engage with some of your work years later. So thanks for taking the time to do that.
Don is a great economist. In my opinion.
It was. I enjoyed the class, but anywho, so I appreciate that you kind of talk about how the way that you frame a lot of these ideas in the tradition of liberalism is that it is common and it is something that anybody can participate in, and I think that's something that's lost on a lot of people.
Yeah,
but what would you to that point? You talked earlier about the populism on the left and the right being very appealing, and there are a lot of reasons why that may or may not be. But what do you find is like an effective way for, let's say, communicating with people who, maybe they're not in a position to be a great inventor right now. They're having a hard time and they're finding themselves getting caught up by these ideas that are offering them something more than that process of
I'm here
participate in liberalism.
I'm here, as I mentioned, I think in Tucson for a couple of months to help my sister get established in her new home here in Tucson. And actually tomorrow morning, she's going to have a knee operation, so I'll be taking care of her that way. But I'm also at the Freedom Center, as it's called, at the University of Arizona, which is a small group of liberals, and mainly in the Department of Philosophy at Arizona. And I'm going to be speaking in a couple of weeks to this group. And the topic is what you asked, namely, why is it we're going to have all this is a lunchtime conversation. What are the arguments that we advocates for adultism, for liberty of permission? It's not the starting place or the ending place. It's the permission that's crucial to liberalism. Why can't we get this across? Why, as you say, are people so entranced by the idea? I mean, for example, in Chile, in which liberalism was imposed with the fist. This is the great tragedy of modern Chile. A lot of students of mine from the University of Chicago were involved in it. This great engine of prosperity is forgotten by the Chileans, and they've just turned back to socialism. And that's, even in Chile, they're going down the road of Venezuela. I hope they're going to come to their senses. And indeed, I think, and this shows my optimism, I think that the populism of left and right is peaking in its appeal. I think there are signs, for example, in Hungary, that the population is deciding, whoops, this wasn't such a swell idea. And it's surely the case in Venezuela. And in Cuba, it's long been the case. But the problem, of course, is that these tyrants of the left and the right, Erdogan in Turkey, for example, is failing in his economy. First killed the journalists, then the academics, then their opponents. So I don't know. We'll see how it turns out.
And I guess one quick one, you spent a ton of time at the intersection of economics and literature and the humanities. Is there just like a great book of fiction that you feel like is kind of in line with your ideas that you think we should read?
Well, there are a number
I'm sure you
of
have a
them,
bunch.
but here's one I would really recommend. It's the last Russian novel by, I'm going to remember his, oh, Jesus, I'm not going to remember. It's called, it's English translation, and I'm told the original Russian is called Forever Flowing. And this is by a, God, what is his name? A very big Russian novelist who was once a communist and became a liberal, Forever Flowing. And it's an astonishingly gripping view of what was terrible about Stalinism. Maybe here, yes, Vasily Grossman. Vasily Grossman. It's a great novel.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Who's next?
Daniel.
I will be brief. Thank you for having me. I was wondering if you had if you had written on anything like an opposite of the theory of innovism. So a theory on what causes the destruction of wealth, either because bad ideas are propagated or because ideas are somewhat self-censorious and they tend to be memory hold.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I've written a good deal sort of on the edges of it. I was once going to do a book about why this brief period of intellectual liberalism in France and Britain and Sweden and the United States and various other places in the early 19th century turned to centralization, socialism in one form or another. Actually, one sort of alarming phrase was the new liberalism, which was articulated by political philosophers in Britain in the 1880s. You see it in American progressivism. You see it in England in Fabian socialism, clause for labor politics and so forth. But I haven't done much on it because I keep thinking about it and I can't figure out why it changed. You write the book. Tell me why it's this great idea with tremendous human fruit came to be thought of as conservative, or you don't like poor people or something like that. I think one thing we can do, as at least I'll speak for myself, one thing I can do as a liberal is keep pointing out that liberalism actually helps poor people. Whereas standard issue, so-called new liberalism, which is socialism of one sort or another, is virtue signaling, but actually ends up hurting poor people.
If you've read The Fountainhead, the character that pops into my head is Ellsworth Toohey. So in any case, he's the only villain that I know of. He's written as someone who deliberately propagates bad ideas for the purposes of bringing down society.
Well, come on. We've just had an experience of 4 years of a president who does exactly that. So we don't have to turn to Ayn Rand. I didn't read Ayn Rand when I was young. And then I tried to read Ayn Rand when I was older, just to be fair. And she was a script writer in Hollywood. You'd think she'd write better novels. 18-year-olds love The Fountainhead. I couldn't get paid past page 30.
Well, this 30-year-old does as well, but thank you very much.
You're very welcome, dear.
Wonderful. So I wanted to pivot the conversation towards your latest book to be released. I believe that I'm correct in that, which is Bettering Humanomics. I became familiar with your work about statistical significance as an undergrad when I was getting frustrated about the over-reliance on statistical significance or blindly listening to statistical software. And you've talked also about the sins of economics and your vision for a more rich and robust form of the economic science. So we'd love to hear more.
Well, yes, and I call it Humanomics. My friend Bart Wilson, by the way, is here in Tucson for a couple of months like I am. He's the one who coined the term. He's a professor of economics at law at Chapman University. He's an experimental economist and does very serious experimental work with humans and chimpanzees and so forth. But so the idea is not an English professor's, as I have been, idea that, well, let's not do any of that quantitative stuff. Let's not do any math. It makes my head ache. Let's just do stories. That's not the idea. The idea is to take stories seriously, to take metaphors seriously, to take philosophy seriously, as well as taking neuroscience and experiments and regression analysis and so forth serious. So it's a supplement to economics, and to economics of the orthodox sort. I don't want to call it mainstream because then that makes me a side stream, and I'm not a side stream. But the problem is that orthodox economics, I call it Samuelsonian economics. By the way, Paul Anthony Samuelson, a great economist, one of the very great economists of the last century, Paul Samuelson, in case you need to know this, was my mother's longtime mixed doubles tennis partner. So my mother and father knew Paul Samuelson well. I don't call him Paul because I didn't ever know him. I think I shook hands with him once and that's it. But modern economics is very much shaped by this one man, Paul Samuelson, and amazingly, by his brother-in-law, Kenneth Arrow. Their mutual nephew is Summers, the Secretary of the Treasury, the youngest professor of economics at Harvard ever. It's an astonishing family. All four of the parents were economists, and two of them were Nobel Prize winners, the uncles of Larry. Okay, all that. The problem is that this intellectual program, this scientific program, has made two big mistakes. One is relying on existence theorems. And it's the contrast between an engineering or physical view of mathematics and the Department of Mathematics view of mathematics. Engineers and physicists, and I think economists, do and should be interested in quantities. And if some functional form will help them measure actual things in the world, I'm all for it, and I want more of it. But the trouble is that really since Aristotle, and not so much Adam Smith. Adam Smith was an empiricist of a wonderful sort, but since Ricardo, in some ways John Stuart Mill, but certainly the marginalists and everyone through and including Paul Anthony Samuelson, has taken to thinking that existence theorems are the way forward in economic science. So you say, here are the assumptions for an economy to be perfectly competitive. And then you say, my word, these are strange assumptions. Every industry has to have convex production sets, blah, 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 blah. Have to be an infinite number of traders, blah, 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 blah. And then they go on, the economists go off and do this. They say there exist externalities. Well, that's not very interesting. I don't want to be told that they exist. I already know that. If I wear a hideous burnt orange dress, the older women here will remember burnt orange from the 1980s. That's an externality. That imposes pain on other people. And it's terrible for me to do that. And I'm not going to do it. But the question is, how big are these externalities? And that is a factual, empirical question, which to a shocking degree, economists have not answered. I have an essay which is part of this book coming out, as you mentioned, in June, against positivism is the short title, where I counted the number of imperfections that economists have claimed the economy has. And I come up with how many? 108 since 1848. Meanwhile, income per head in the countries that have adopted market innovism has increased 3,000%. So this terribly imperfect economy has enriched people. So that's the first mistake, is existence theorem. The second mistake, as you mentioned, is reliance on a little teeny technique. It sounds innocent in itself, called statistical significance, tests of statistical significance. And the problems with this, was realized by the American Statistical Association in an official report 5 years ago, are appalling. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but let me just say, the problem is with tests of statistical significance is it supposes that numbers come with their own interpretation. And that's no more true of numbers than it is of words. We're bathed in interpretations as human beings. If you ask me, what is the weather like in Tucson, Arizona this evening, or this, well, it's starting to get dark, this evening, I'll say 6. And you'll say, what? 6 what? What? Don't you believe in numbers? It's 6. And you'll say, come on, dear, what 6 on what scale? Just 6. Stop it. And that is essentially what the test of statistical significance, if it lacks what in the Cray is called a substantive loss function, that's what is happening. So on the theoretical side, they've run off to do existence theorems, no measurement. On the side of the econometrics that is supposed to be the measurement part of economics, they have screwed up royally. So there's a big problem with Samuelsonian economics. And the solution is to get serious about measurement on both sides. And measurement includes questionnaires. It includes simulation, which is an extremely important method, say in meteorology, and certainly is very important in physics and engineering and chemistry, simulation. Now they're able to simulate on computers very complex molecules in chemistry. This is something of an AI breakthrough, which is going to eventually allow chemists to invent new compounds on the computer. Okay, there should there should be the sort of short definition of humanomics. It's economics with the humans left in. So you allow yourself to take seriously theology. I'm very interested in economics and theology, and I'm working. I think I mentioned I'm working on a book now about that. Take seriously fiction. Jane Austen, my beloved Jane Austen, is a wonderful, gives wonderful insights into ethical maturation, ethical growth in her major characters, especially the young women who are always her main major character. And she also gives insight in an amazing book on game theory and Jane Austen, written by a political scientist at San Diego. He points out that the minor characters.
We did a salon on that. We did a salon. We did an Interintellect salon on Jane Austen.
Did you really?
Game theory. Yes, it was fabulous.
It's very interesting because at first I thought, when I was asked to tell, was it Cambridge or Oxford that published it, whether they should publish it, I thought, oh, Jesus, game theory and Jane Austen, oh, that's going to be awful. No, this guy is very sophisticated and very intelligent, and it makes a lot of sense for the minor characters. The big distinction in Jane Austen is between the handful, 2 or 3 major characters, and all the kind of cardboard figures. The mothers especially are passionately interested only in getting good matches for their daughters. It is a truth universally acknowledged that that's all you should care about. Okay, so there are, it's not so much that the humanities can hand over findings. That's not much to the point. To some degree they can. The study of history, for example, is surely very important for a serious economist, I think. Most economists don't agree with that, but I think so. And then there'll be findings that might be to the point in thinking about economics. But that's not the main point. The main point is that we ought to, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but like Adam Smith, like the blessed Adam Smith, cross yourself, we should treat people in the economy as human beings. We should think of them as human. And this Max U, I call him Max U auf Deutsch in German, maximize utility subject to constraints. Max U. He's this character. He's this vending machine. He's a sociopath. He is literally a sociopath. He may care about you, but only because your happiness is in his utility function, right? So if you're happy, he's happy. But wait a second, is that love? No woman here would think it's a great thing for their lover to say, I love you because your happiness makes me happy. Wait a second. Don't you love me, you jerk? So anyway, that's the program, to make, in a sense, in fact, Vernon Smith, who's a very wise economist, also an experimental economist at Chapman, he wants to call it Smithian economics, and that's fine with me. It's the kind of economics that Adam Smith did. Look, Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. We've mentioned that. But his first book that made his reputation in Europe as a moral philosopher was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I really recommend this book to you. It is a terrifically good book. I think it's better than The Wealth of Nations. In fact, he thought so too. He loved TMS, as we Smith scholars call it, more than The Wealth of Nations. And how do I know that? Because he kept revising the theory of moral sentiments, and indeed was revising the last 6th edition as he died in 1790. So
Eli,
that's Humanomics.
Sorry to interrupt. I think Eli had a question or a comment.
Sure.
Yeah, just a final question. And thank you, Dr. McCloskey. Like it was very enlightening to hear you speak and bring the books that you have written back to life and like put a face to and the rhetoric behind it. And I just wanted to end with a question. And it's like in Aristotle Poetics, there's a line that says that the language of politics is tragedy, right?
Yeah.
You could actually extend that. Do you think that extends to economics? Like, do we need to be harping on the same trite, like the same trite exploitation of Carlyle, like the dismal signs? How can we make economics?
Well, understand why Thomas Carlyle called it the dismal science. He was a friend of John Stuart Mill's. Carlyle was a conservative Scotsman in England, Britain in the early 19th century. And he was the one who made up the phrase that political economy, as it was then called, was the dismal science. And the reason he said it was dismal is because his friend John Stuart Mill and the other liberals were in favor of ending slavery in the British Empire. Carlyle, as a conservative, was against ending slavery in the British Empire and looked with fondness back on serfdom, lords and serfs, because he thought that was a wonderful arrangement, that these poor darkies in Jamaica, they couldn't take care of themselves. And just like the serfs in medieval England, they had a wonderful lord who would guide them. This was, as you know, a very common opinion among slave apologists for slavery in the 1850s, for example. So that's why it's called dismal science. But it's true that Austrian economics, Samuelssonian economics, not Marxism really, has a tragic view that things are scarce and there's not a heck of a lot we can do about it. Actually, I withdraw my characterization of Austrian economics, because modern Austrian economics, such as at George Mason, is optimistic. And I think optimism is so Humanomics can be optimistic. Now, as a number of you have pointed out, there are grave political dangers along the way to this liberal society of adults able to take care of themselves. Now, I by the way, I'm in favor of, as a Christian, I'm in favor of charity of various kinds, but I think that the best way to help poor people is to allow them to work and to for us all to contribute mutually to each other's prosperity and indeed each other's ethical education. You know, I was raised in a household that was somewhat unusual. My father was a professor at Harvard. My mother, as I mentioned, was an opera singer. So I chose my parents very cleverly. I think I should deserve tremendous credit for this. I'm such a smart person. But in any case, you'd think, well, these people must have been terrible snobs, and they weren't. Both my mother and father respected manual labor, for instance. My mom was especially respectful of craftsmen of various sorts. And I worked on the highway department of my town in Boston, in the Boston suburbs in college. And that kind of egalitarianism, I think, is an essential quality of the modern world. One of the most horrible things that Trump has done is to attack that idea, saying that people who serve in the military are, and even die in the military, are suckers, and that this horrible "I've got mine, screw you" version of so-called capitalism is deeply unethical, and I think in the end unsuccessful. I mean, Donald Trump is no great master of the business world.
So I have a question about, so when I watched your talk on statistical significance, that was about a decade ago, and I'm curious if you've seen any positive improvements in the field, or if you've seen any, or if you have any examples of economic literature that are in the spirit of humanomics.
Well, a few. On the spirit of humanomics, I can only recommend my own work. But no, that's false, because there have been precursors of this. My great and dear friend Arjo Klamer, Arjo Klamer, Klamer, is a famous Dutch economist. A daughter of his is named after me. That's how close we are. And he was doing humanomics before I realized what it was. Albert Hirschman, the great economist at Harvard and then at the Institute for Advanced Study, is an example of humanomics. Kenneth Bolden spent much of his career at the University of Colorado, was an Englishman and a Quaker. And by the way, another of the people I admire because he stuttered like I do. Winston Churchill, Marilyn Monroe, and Joe Biden, all were stutterers, and so was Bolden. And Bolden was a great Quaker and did humanomics. Indeed, the rabbi whom I mentioned, although Israel Kirzner doesn't quite bring his religion and his economics close enough together, I don't think. He's an important American rabbi, I'm told. Important in American Judaism, conservative Judaism. And Adam Smith and in some ways Alfred Marshall and Keynes in his own way was doing humanomics, and certainly Smith and then there are continental versions of this. So it's got a long, thin history in economics, and we got to make it larger, and we got to overcome this foolishness of confining economics to theorem proving and statistical significance.
Thank you. Anna, I think you had a question.
Thank you. I'm only asking very short questions today. So it's
I'll give short answers.
Okay, you don't have to, but I will try to keep my questions very short. There was an aside maybe 30 minutes ago where you said that you don't like the word capitalism.
Yeah.
tell us what to use instead. I'm also on the fence.
You should you should use the word innovism. Innovism, because it's more sensible from a scientific point of view. The problem with third capitalism is, and I got a lot of evidence for this, it keeps misleading people into thinking that delta K is the key to our enrichment, right? And you can find lots of testimony of this from Marx and alas, even Adam Smith. You know, they're although, by the way, Marx didn't call it capitalism. He spoke of capitalists, but it was his followers who coined the word Kapitalismus in German. But it's the wrong word. Steve Forbes, an acquaintance of my friendly acquaintance of mine, his magazine is called Forbes Capitalist Tool. And there's a kind of a brazen adoption of the word by the right, which I think is equally misleading, because I have friends on the right who think, like their Marxist enemies, that accumulation of capital is the soul of innovism, and it's not. It's the liberty, the encouragement to creativity in the arts, in science, in personal life, in the economy. That's in our faiths. That's what we're on about, and that's innovism.
I love this word, but there's also Alaka and I, we talk about abundance a lot, and we're trying to build something that is abundantist,
Sure,
prosperous.
Yeah, but
there's something in our thinking and in our morality where there's just no word for it.
I agree, it's abundant, all right, but that's the result, and I think it's desirable to separate the cause from the result. I think it's just to be systematic about it.
Thank you.
Innovation is the cause, and the result is abundance. And the abundance, to go back to some of the issues that some of you raised, is not necessarily corrupting. It can be. We can be too damn rich. In fact, you know, and I know that, look, what would have happened to you personally if at age 18 you had received a $10 million inheritance? Well, I know what would have happened to me. I would not have gone to graduate school. I might not have finished college. I would have just relaxed on the beach in Cannes in the season. So there is a danger in abundance.
I would have totally gone to some very expensive American school, because that was the other side of the Iron Curtain. Not non-existent at the time, but still. But yeah.
Yeah.
We'll take one last question from Nasser, and then we'll close.
Okay. Prof, you mentioned that you try to relate theology and economics.
I do.
And yes. As a Muslim, also an Abrahamic faith like Catholicism and Islam. So I think that there's a problem of the notion of usury, if my pronunciation is correct,
that's right.
and so on. So how? I mean, can you? What they call for us is like disaster usually is very exploitative. What is your opinion? Do you envisage a world without usury? Is there a possibility a better world? Yeah.
I don't think so. I think it's a mistake. It goes back to Aristotle, which, as you know, was a great influence on Islamic thought, because it was the Arabs, or at least the speakers of Arabic, who translated the Greek of Aristotle into Arabic, and then it was translated in Spain into Latin. So the Latins, the Franks in France and Germany and so forth, they learned about Aristotle through the Muslims, but he didn't understand the economy very well. It's not terribly surprising, and he thought that agriculture was honorable because you worked hard and you got the fruits of the earth. But mere middlemen were terrible because they didn't do any work. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas, another person influenced by Arabic thought, incidentally, tried in the 13th century to justify middlemen as working, as of course they do. But what bothered Aristotle, and then it kept creeping into Jewish and Christian and Islamic thought, all three of them. What bothered them was the apparent lack of work in just holding a bond, right? So, holding a promise to pay off, and then you just sit there and you get rich. But an economy can't work without interest, essentially. And in Islamic economics, they get around it. In St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval scholasticism, they got around it. In Judaism, they get around it because you have to. You have to price the future. If you don't price the future, you have a situation such as in the old Soviet Union, in the Eastern Bloc, in which, because of this very doctrine that there's something evil about interest, the sort of modern version of it is Marxism, they didn't price capital because capital was bad and it was bourgeois, and that was, earning interest was a terrible thing. And so they screwed up their economy in a massive way. It was.
Can you recommend a good book? Can you recommend a good book on that, on usually, the positive aspect, usually?
Who is it again?
Can you recommend a book on this question of usually?
No, I can't, because I get so irritated when I hear about it, because I mean not irritated at you, but the thing is that for just allocation, not this matter of innovation, that's another matter, but for just allocation to keep the economy from being very inefficient, you've got to price the future in terms of the present. And that's the interest rate. So it's not, I get very impatient. So I haven't bothered to look very closely into this literature. You do it and then explain it to me.
Thank you. So we are at time, and unfortunately we have to close, but thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to close on a note of optimism. You've always been an optimist, even when pessimism often seems to prevail. So I wanted to ask, what can we all do to promote optimism, innovation, and the bourgeois virtues as we leave today?
Well, that's to end in a sort of a sermon. And at the end of a standard Christian, I'm sure it's true elsewhere, sermon, you're to give precisely what you said: actions, things to do. And I think the thing to do is to advocate for liberty, and to make sure we do. And liberty is liberty is liberty. If you're free in your business, and you're free in your speech, and you're free in your marriage, and you're free in your even gender choice, or free in this, free in that, they're all one, and we should be advocating for them politely, considerately, in a truly loving way. So go forth and sin no more.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you so much, both. This was fantastic.
You.
I've enjoyed it.
I'm
As my dad used to say, he had a great final line. It's a very old joke. Be good. If you can't be good, be careful.
There we go.
Okay, cheerio.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye, everyone.